Hi there, and welcome to the first lecture on cryptography, which is the final topic for the CNS course. In this lecture video, I will discuss the introduction, including also some building blocks necessary to understand the later parts, and a very brief part on blockchain. And then in the later lecture videos, I will discuss different types and considerations of cryptography, in particular symmetric cryptography, asymmetric cryptography, as well as how to deal with keys. It's important to note that in CNS we focus mostly on the systems related stuff, but cryptography is obviously a very important topic to understand to be able to build secure systems. As such, we do consider cryptography to be a very important topic, and we do include it. However, we consider this to be just an introduction to cryptography. So many details are left out, and we focus mostly on how to apply cryptography in reality. If you want to know more about the topic, there is a more advanced course in the form of coding and cryptography, which is available in the master's program if you're interested. Let's start with an introduction to cryptography, where I will discuss some of the history of cryptography very briefly, as well as some of the key concepts in cryptography. So first of all, what is cryptography? Well, crypto is when we talk about allowing secure communication between two or more parties in the presence of an attacker. Now, there are multiple types of attackers possible. In the general case, we often talk about Alice and Bob communicating, where Alice wants to send a message to Bob, achieving particular security properties. Now, to understand those security properties, we also need to understand our attacker. And in this context, we typically talk about Eve as an attacker who can intercept messages, so read the messages, but is unable to modify them. So Eve generally wants to be able to leak information. Now, there's also a more powerful opponent, which is Mallory. And Mallory is also able to modify the messages and go in between Alice and Bob. This often allows more power to corrupt data, but sometimes also more power to intercept data that is encrypted. Now, a proper approach to cryptography manages to make sure that Eve and Mallory are unable to read or modify any of the communication without Alice or Bob finding out. For cryptography to be successful, we typically want to achieve one or more particular goals. And these goals are always classified in a number of standard groups. So the first one is confidentiality, and this is the one we most associate crypto with. Now, the idea of confidentiality is that neither Eve nor Mallory is able to read Alice's messages to Bob. So Alice can confidentially send a message to Bob that others are unable to understand, even if they can intercept or modify the messages that were sent over the network. Integrity is another important property, which means that Mallory is unable to alter Alice's messages without Bob finding out. And this, of course, also means not being able to completely forge a message, pretending to be Alice as the sender. Then there is authentication, which is about verifying someone's identity. So with authentication, Mallory cannot convince Bob that she's actually Alice. Obviously, authentication is a critical component of other mechanisms as well. For example, in case of integrity, if we don't know who sent the message, well, it's quite questionable what the meaning actually is of the message having integrity. Because if the message might be sent by someone we don't trust, we cannot consider the message to be really the original message that we wanted. Right? So authentication is also critical to almost all crypto. And finally, non-repudiation. Now this is the one students typically have most difficulty with understanding. So non-repudiation means that whoever sent the message cannot deny that they were the sender. Now this is different from authentication. So in case of authentication, when Alice sends a message to Bob, Bob is able to verify that Alice was the one who sent the message. But this doesn't really mean that Bob is able to prove to others that it was indeed Alice who sent the message. So with just authentication, Bob would know that he got the message from Alice, but be unable to prove it to others. With non-repudiation, on the other hand, Bob would be able to prove that it was actually Alice who sent the message, rather than it could have been Mallory, but it might also have been himself. So if Bob himself was able to generate the same document, then you would not achieve non-repudiation, because Alice could always legitimately claim that it was actually Bob who sent the message himself, or who forged the message himself. Cryptography has been used long before computers existed, and many theories of cryptography were developed well before computers existed as well. So in a military context, it's often been very important to be able to communicate in secret, right? So you would tell some other general when you would attack, but if the other party were able to intercept the messenger and get this information, they might be able to prevent your victory, right? So if you send the messenger and they know the message, then your opponent could simply capture the messenger and torture them until they reveal the message. Now this was of course very undesirable, so what you would do was not give the messenger the actual message, but rather change the message in such a way that even the messenger themselves would be unable to figure out what the message was. Then they could be tortured as long as the opponent wanted, but would never be able to reveal your secret. So, cryptography was critical in military context, and Julius Caesar was one of the people who was well known to be a user of cryptography, although he was definitely not the earliest. So what Caesar did is now known as the Caesar cipher, and what he did was he disguised the message by shifting all the letters in the alphabet with a fixed amount. So this would be an example where all the letters are shifted by 3. So the D, for example, would become an A after shifting, going 3 positions to the left. Now of course this doesn't help for the letters at the start of the alphabet, so what you do is you wrap them around instead. Now of course this was not the version of the alphabet that Caesar used, but for the modern alphabet it works just as well. So you shift the letters by simply deducting 3 from the position and then taking the letter that results. Now this is encryption of the message. How you would decrypt is simply by shifting back to the right, against wrapping around where necessary. So this way we can encrypt the message and it results in this particular string. So the question now is, what does this message actually mean? Please stop the recording and try to see if you can figure out for yourself. You will see that the skill comes in handy later on, so it might be good to practice right now. Okay, I'll continue and reveal the message. Now the message is Veni Vidi Vici, which of course was a very well-known saying by Caesar himself. I come, I see, and I win. So, in this context we introduce some more terminology that's also critical when talking about cryptography. First of all, the plain text. Now the plain text is the message that it's all about, the message that we want to send. So we want Alice to come up with the plain text, and we want Bob to be able to receive the plain text. This is the readable text to be transmitted, and in the example I showed, this was Veni Vidi Vici. Next, the cipher text is the unreadable text that is actually sent. So to be able to transmit the message, we must send some information, and this information must be unreadable for the attacker, Eve in this case. So this was the string that we solved before, where the letters were shifted. Now next, encryption is the process of taking a plain text and converting it into a ciphertext. Now in case of the example, this was to shift the alphabet to the left by 3 positions. And finally, decryption takes the ciphertext and makes it readable again as a plain text. So this is the opposite operation from encryption. And in case of the example, it's done by shifting the alphabet to the right with 3 positions again, so that you get your original plain text back. Now, if I had to choose one message, which you remember from the class on cryptography, it would be this one. All the other stuff you can just look up when you need it, but this is something you always need to keep in mind when working on cryptography, and it's known as Kerckhoffs Principle. And again, this is far older than computers actually are, so this was already known even before we did modern crypto, but it's still equally applicable. And the core is to separate the algorithm from the key whenever you do encryption. So you don't want to have to keep the algorithm secret, you only want to keep the key secret. And there are many reasons to do it like this. In the example I gave you with the Caesar cipher, the algorithm would be, for example, to shift the alphabet by n positions. And then the key could be -3, as in shift to the left by 3 positions. Now, why would we want to work based on this assumption? If we assume that the attacker knows the algorithm, it is in part because it's so hard to keep the algorithm secret. So if the attacker intercepts even just one computing device able to perform the computation, then they can easily figure out what the algorithm is through reverse engineering. So it's very hard to keep the algorithm secret. Moreover, we really want to reuse the algorithm between different communications and when talking to different parties, because generating an algorithm is a lot of human work and it's much harder than generating a key, which can be done automatically. Finally, we want openness. We want experts to be able to look for weaknesses in the algorithm, because it turns out cryptography is super hard. And even if you get a great cryptographer, a great mathematician who understands everything, it's very possible that they overlook stuff. So experts should be able to look for weaknesses. So we assume that the algorithm is known and we keep the key secret. Now it's not necessary to make the algorithm public specifically, but it would be wise because it offers an opportunity for more experts to look at the algorithm. The key, of course, we keep secret. And this is the difference between Bob and Eve. Bob knows the key, but Eve does not. Right? So knowing the key is critical to whether or not you're able to decipher a message. Now, the opposite of Kerckhoffs Principle is security by obscurity. And we see this a lot. We see a lot of cases where people are not careful with security, and especially in the context of crypto. Now, it's very easy to think that you can make something nice of your own and people will never be able to figure it out. But it turns out there's a lot of very clever cryptographers out there who are great at figuring out how an algorithm works. So, security by obscurity means that we try to keep the communication secret by keeping the algorithm a secret. And this means developing one's own cryptographic algorithms. Now, this is something that often seems like a good idea at the time, but it's super easy to get it wrong. Again, even very smart people made mistakes in cryptographic algorithms which later had to be fixed and which exposed their users to, for example, breaches in confidentiality. It's also, again, very hard to find out the flaws if you cannot have experts look at it. And also, once the algorithm is compromised, you need to start all over again. So don't do this, please. And this was, I think, the core message of the lecture on cryptography, although there is, of course, still a lot to learn about specific types of crypto as well. Of course, it's unreasonable to expect that once we do crypto, the attacker will automatically just give up. This is not how the world works. The attacker will attempt to break our crypto. And in fact, you've already done this yourselves in the first assignment. Now, the most basic attack on crypto is brute force. And a brute force attack means trying to decrypt a message with every possible key. So, you try to decrypt the message, look at the results and see whether anything gives sensible output. For example, in case of text messages, you might look whether all of the message now becomes ASCII characters. And those ASCII characters are consistent with, say, the English language. In other cases, if you have binary data, there might be checksums or other templates in the format that allow you to recognize whether this follows a particular pattern. So you try all the keys and see whether there's one that yields output that seems plausible. Now, in case of the Caesar cipher, we have only 26 keys. And one of these keys, namely shifting by 0, actually leaves the plain text unmodified. Now, this is known as a weak key, and you shouldn't use it. So this number is so low that even a human could brute force it. So this algorithm, even though it was used in the past, is so weak that there's really no way you can use it in practice securely. Now, the solution against brute force attacks is a larger key space. The more keys you have available, the harder it will be for the attacker to go through all the keys. And at some point, it's no longer viable. Now let's say that we change the algorithm. Rather than always shifting by a fixed amount, we map every letter of the alphabet to a random other letter, such that we get a permutation. So each letter is replaced by a random letter, and now we have a much larger key space. So can you think of how many keys we might have now? Keep in mind that the first letter might be mapped to any of the 26 letters available, but the second can no longer be mapped to whichever letter was already taken for the first. Otherwise, we have no permutation, and the result might not be reversible. So, I recommend that you pause the recording now, think about this approach, and think how many keys we have right now. The answer is this. 26 factorial, which means 26 times 25 times 24 and so on. Right, so the A can be mapped to 26 characters, but once we decide to map the A to a K, we can no longer map any of the others to a K. So there's 25 possibilities for the mapping of the B. Now this is mapped to the X, so for the C there's only 24 left, and so on, which is why we get the factorial. Now this is a very large number, right? So 4 times 10 to the power 26. This is definitely no longer viable to try all the keys. At this point, we defeated the brute force attack. But this is of course not the only attack that's possible. Now another attack against the Caesar cipher, including the variant I proposed later, is frequency analysis. And this is based on the observation that for a given key, every letter of plaintext is always mapped to the same letter of ciphertext. This means that patterns are still revealed. And we also know that some letters are much more common than others, at least in natural languages. For example, we have this table of letter frequency in English, which shows that the E is by far the most common letter. Now, can you think of an attack that would exploit this information to be able to figure out the key? Well, the attack is as follows. We look for the letter in the ciphertext that is the most common. Now this one is probably the letter E, if we have a sufficiently long ciphertext, because any text in English will eventually have the E turn out as the most common letter. Now let's go on and look for the second most common one. Now this is probably the A. And this way, if we have a sufficiently long text, in the end we can figure out which letter is which. Now of course this may not always be perfect, but even in the case it's not perfect, it greatly reduces the number of possibilities. And we can brute force the remaining possibilities. So if we cannot distinguish, for example, the T and the A clearly, we can simply try both possibilities and see which makes more sense. Now, this means eventually we find the plain text as well as the key, so this algorithm isn't very strong either. It still reveals patterns in the ciphertext that also occur in the plain text, which allows the key to be recovered. Now this means that the algorithm is much weaker than brute force would suggest. As such, the algorithm can be considered to be broken. Cryptanalysis is a field of research in which people try to break ciphers using information that is obtained by the attacker. So this is kind of similar to the hacking we did in system security, except that now it's mathematicians rather than computer scientists doing the work. Now, like before, we can have different threat models. In this case, we will refer to them as attack models. And if you have a stronger threat model that you can resist using your algorithms, it means you have a more secure algorithm. Now, the weakest attack model is those that require only a known ciphertext to break. So if you have an attacker who can only obtain a known ciphertext and they can still break the algorithm. So this again is a very weak attacker because they only have the information that would be sent over the wire anyway. Then of course your algorithm is very weak. You really don't want a situation where the key can be derived from just a known ciphertext. Now the second, a stronger attacker might have the known plaintext and its corresponding ciphertext. So we want to be able to resist an attacker, that is, not allow the attacker to figure out the key and decrypt any other messages, even if they have a known mapping between plaintext and ciphertext. Now this is common if the attacker is able to know some of the message. Right, so for example, it was known in the Second World War that some messages would start with Heil Hitler. And the British, trying to decrypt these messages, would have this information and would try to use this information to see if they could derive the key and figure out other parts of the message. Now, the strongest attack model is chosen plaintext. This is the situation in which the attacker doesn't only have ciphertext and plaintext available, but is able to generate it at will. So the attacker can choose a plaintext and find out what the ciphertext for this plaintext is. Now this is something that's common if you have a server that anyone can use. So for example, if you have a server that can sign messages for you and the attacker can access it, then they typically have a situation where they have a chosen plaintext and they can obtain the corresponding ciphertext. Now an algorithm that doesn't allow the attacker to figure out the key and decrypt the other messages even under these circumstances is a very strong algorithm. What I've discussed so far is known as substitution ciphers, and these are only of historical interest because these approaches are simply insecure for the reasons I mentioned and should not be used today. So the only remaining application is really obfuscation, making sure that something is not trivial to read, even if you know that you don't fully protect it. A typical example would be ROT 13, which is simply a Caesar cipher using 13 as the base. So with this base, what you get is that the operation to encrypt is the same as the operation to decrypt. Now again, this is only used for obfuscation, not for any serious cryptography purpose. Modern encryption needs to use different approaches to overcome this problem. The alternatives are to do different substitutions in different positions, but again, you need to be very careful to make sure that you cannot find the patterns in the substitutions, or to encrypt data block by block. Now, if you encrypt block by block, you have blocks of multiple characters, which means there are many more possibilities for each block. Now, this also means that it becomes much harder to find patterns. Although, as we'll see later, it's still something that we need to think about. Now, another important consideration is encryption and computation. Now, and in principle, for almost every type of encryption, a brute force attack is fundamentally possible. If you know the plaintext as well as the corresponding ciphertext, you should be able to figure out the key, because there will typically be only one or perhaps few keys that is able to perform this particular mapping from plaintext to ciphertext. Right, so usually only one key gives this mapping, and if we try all the keys, which is at most 2 to the power n keys that we need to try, where n is the number of bits, then we can always figure out which key this was. However, it's also important to note that even if we add just one bit to the key size, the effort for Alice and Bob is increased only marginally. Right, doing arithmetic with one more bit is not a lot more effort. However, for Eve it doubles the effort. Eve will need to do twice as much work even for just one extra bit. So that is hopeful. If we make sure the key size is large enough, we should be able to use this exponential growth to prevent Eve from doing a brute force attack. Now, since we know that it's possible to just use compute power to break crypto, our goal is not so much to make it impossible to break an algorithm, but to make sure that it's not much harder, not much easier than it would be if you use brute force. So essentially, a cryptographic algorithm tries to prevent shortcuts, where Eve can break the algorithm faster than would be possible with brute force. And an attack is then also defined as being able to recover the key with significantly less effort than it would take using brute force. When thinking about crypto, it's also very important to keep in mind what is practical. Now, we can think of all sorts of nice theoretic possibilities about how to secure the system and making it almost impossible for an attacker to break, even in the far future. Right? So as this XKCD comic already says, you might think, if I have a sufficiently large key and a strong algorithm, such as RSA in this case, then it will be impossible to break unless you have a supercomputer cluster that's unthinkable in current times. Right? So we cannot break it unless we build a $1 million cluster. In practice, it might be very different. His laptop's encrypted. Let's drug him and hit him with this $5 wrench until he tells us the password. Right? And this way we've also broken the system. If we can leak data in some other way, then the crypto is not secure either. Now we'll be talking a little bit in this lecture about security of cryptography, but do keep in mind that cryptography is not usually the weakest link. So it's not typically these theoretical attacks against crypto that are the main issue. Using cryptography wrong or implementing your own is typically a good reason to get it wrong. Right? So it's actually typically the implementation errors rather than errors in the algorithm where it goes wrong. Even if there are plenty of algorithms which have had failures in regard to security in the past. Let's keep for a moment the focus on practical applications. So the first question is, where do we need confidentiality? Now this is very, very common in computer science, needing confidentiality. It's essentially any situation where one can eavesdrop traffic that is in any way confidential. So typical examples are to protect yourself against intermediate hosts in internet routing. As you should know by now, there are many servers in between whenever we try to access a server. Also, wiretapping or listening to Wi-Fi traffic is a major threat. So people might be trying to intercept your Wi-Fi traffic and use your data from there, or wiretap your actual wires. Moreover, protocols might be insecure. So for example, DNS, the domain name system that allows you to look up a server, can be poisoned to redirect you to a different server, which means that we need crypto to protect ourselves from this server reading the data that we wanted to send to Bob. BGP hijacking is a similar thing against the backbone of the internet. So there are many ways in which network protocols cannot ensure us that our data ends up only at the intended recipient. In these cases, we do need to protect our traffic. Now this one of course will never be relevant for you, but who knows, just in case, ISPs are legally required to help the police and secret services to do wiretapping, which means that if you don't want your data to fall in the hands of the secret services, you might also want to use confidentiality. So what does this mean in practice? Well, basically always network traffic should be encrypted, because it might fall into many wrong hands on the way in being sent over the network. Moreover, it also means that we don't want to send the key over the network, because if we do this, it might equally be intercepted and all hope is lost. What if we encrypt the key? You might ask, well, of course, then what key are you encrypting the key with? Well, this is something we'll see in the future, in the future of this lecture. So let's wait for that. Now, the ideal approach is to use so-called end-to-end encryption, where end-to-end means that only the sender and the recipient have the key. So no one between the sender and the recipient is able to intercept your messages. And this minimizes the risk of any attacker somewhere in between getting the plain text. So a good example would be WhatsApp. So WhatsApp, the client encrypts and decrypts the messages and sends them to a server. Now the server gets the messages, but only in encrypted form, and the server does not obtain the key necessary to decrypt the messages. So this means the server transmits the messages from one client to the other, and only the client is able to decrypt the message and read them. So this means that whenever someone corrupts the server somehow, or perhaps law enforcement forces WhatsApp into giving access to the server, then clients will still not have their secrets become available, because whoever runs the server does not have the key and only has the ciphertext of the messages they send. So this is a good case for end-to-end encryption. At this point in CNS, we should all know why integrity cannot be guaranteed by the network. Right? Spoofing packages is possible, might even be easy in some settings. And this means that we have to assume that if we're sending packages from Alice to Bob, that some attacker might be able to modify them to drop packages or to insert packages. And in fact, of course, an attacker could even initiate sending messages to Bob and spoof, pretending that they are from Alice. So the network provides no integrity, and anything that comes from the network, we cannot know if it was the same as it was sent. This is why we need cryptography to also ensure integrity. The typical approach is to use so-called digital signatures. So the signature is linked to a message, which means that it's no longer valid if the message changes, and also linked to the sender. So someone who doesn't have the correct cryptographic key is unable to sign the digital signature, which means that we cannot have Mallory create a message, sign it, and send it to Bob, as spoofing as if it were coming from Alice. Right, so again, this is critical in any system. The next property is authentication, which is also very important. So integrity is useless in terms of security if we don't know who produced the data. If we have data coming from someone else than we expected, that data cannot be assumed to correspond to integrity because it might be spoofed, right? So we need authentication as well to be able to do integrity, which means that digital signatures also have to authenticate the sender, proving that this was indeed the person who sent it. How do you prove this in the context of crypto? Well, you prove something by showing that you have the key. You generate some type of data that can only be generated using the key. Now, a typical example of why authentication is important is a so-called man-in-the-middle attack. So the threat model that we discussed so far allows Mallory to interpose between the client and the server. So the client will send messages to Mallory, thinking that this is the server, and the server will receive messages from Mallory, thinking that this is the client. Now, Alice sends a request to Mallory, and this is forwarded to the server. Right? This is nothing new yet. Now, the server asks for the password, and then Mallory forwards the message again. Now, of course, Alice now responds with the password, which is Hunter2 in this case. And at this point, we've already won, right? We pretended to be the server and we're getting the password. Now, even confidentiality doesn't necessarily help here because Alice thought she was actually talking to the server and she might be using our key. Right? So then we can forward the content and so on. And now Mallory knows the key and is able to break anything. Right? This is the simplest case of a man-in-the-middle attack with no crypto present at all. Now, if the messages had been authenticated and of course ensure confidentiality, then Mallory would no longer be able to do this. Because then Alice would be able to tell that she was talking to the server or talking to Mallory. Now let's think of a situation where we authenticate the user using a password. And then the user denies that whatever they did on the server was actually done by them. How can we prove that this was actually the user? Well, we can't really do this because not only the user, but also we store the hash of the password. So we could easily spoof the authentication of the user. Now, when is this relevant? This is especially relevant, for example, when signing a contract. Right? So when you buy a house, for example, the notary will verify that it's actually you who signed the contract and will also sign stating that the notary actually verified your identity. Now, this allows non-repudiation. So if you later claim that the signature was not yours, the notary can testify that this was their signature and they actually checked your ID at that point. You can no longer deny that you signed the contract, and you have to accept the consequences of this. Now, this is non-repudiation. Well, how can this be achieved? You need asymmetric signatures. So the issue with symmetric signatures, which we will discuss, is that if Alice and Bob have the same key, then there's no way for Bob to prove that Alice signed. Because if they have the same key, then also Bob has the key and would be able to reproduce the same signature Alice would make. So we need an asymmetric system where Alice and Bob do not have the same keys. Right? Of course, the user will still be able to claim that someone stole their key, but this is their own responsibility. This is clearly not a case of someone repudiating someone they actually signed, but it's the case of someone who was careless with their keys and needs to suffer the consequences. Before we discuss specific cryptographic algorithms, let's look at some of the building blocks that are often used in these algorithms. So a number of primitives form the basis that other algorithms can build on. And we cover only those that are relevant for later topics. In particular, cryptographic hashes and pseudo-random number generators, both of which are critical to implement some of the cryptographic algorithms that we use in daily life. So a cryptographic hash is a simple function that maps a message, which has an arbitrary length, to a hash, which has a fixed length. Now, of course, given that we're mapping from an arbitrary hash to a fixed length, of course the function is not reversible. We can never figure out what longer message was derived from the shorter message for obvious reasons. Now, also, these functions need to be computationally hard to reverse. That is, we shouldn't really be able to find any message that matches the hash efficiently. For this reason, it's also known as a one-way function. So we map the message to a hash, but we cannot revert the hash to any message that gives this hash. Now, we've seen this before, of course. In assignment 1, hashes were used for password storage. And also in HTTP, hashes were used for digest authentication. Now, hashes are very widely used and commonly a part of cryptographic schemes. Now, typically, a hash in cryptography is used as a secure way to identify a message, and because it would be hard to find another message that maps to the same hash. Now, this is, for example, critical for digital signatures. If you have a digital signature, you want to make sure that the signature changes whenever the message changes, and that you cannot find another message that also matches the same signature. Now, this is why you need a good cryptographic hash at the base of such an algorithm. There are some important properties a hash function should satisfy to be able to be useful in cryptographic algorithms. That is, not to be broken too easily. The first one, which is the weakest one, is pre-image resistance. So if we have a hash function, then if we're given a hash h, we should be unable to reverse it. That is, we should not be able to find a message m that has the same hash that we had specified. Now, this prevents the attacker from reversing a hash and finding another message that has the same hash. Second pre-image resistance is a slightly different property where we are not given the hash, but rather we're given another message. Now, given a message with a particular hash, we should be unable to find another message that has the same hash. Now, do note that in this case the attacker has more information, namely they already have a message generating the hash. So this is not so much as about reverting the hash as it is in making sure that messages which are not the same that can be derived from each other easily do not share the same hash. Now, this prevents an attacker from creating a message that has the same signature as a message that was previously signed. Finally, collision resistance, and a hash that is collision resistant is the strongest hash, means that it's hard to find two different messages at all which have the same hash. So the difference between second pre-image resistance and collision resistance is often hard for students to grasp. So the difference is really that in the case of second pre-image resistance, we are given one message and need to derive another message with the same hash. In collision resistance, we're not given any messages. We may freely pick an M1 and need to find any M1 and M2 that have the same hash. Right? So the attacker has more freedom here, and as such, if the hash algorithm can prevent the attack, it's a stronger hash algorithm. Now, collision resistance prevents the attacker from having a message signed and then coming up with another message that was not signed, that has different contents but the same hash and therefore the same signature. Now, there are some well-known hash functions in widespread use. MD5 is an older one that has been used for a long time. The hash is only 128 bits, which means it's a fairly small hash. It was very widely used, but it's now slowly being phased out. And collision resistance for this hash has been long broken. At this point, MD5 is completely broken and should not be used for any security sensitive properties. SHA-1 is another very widely used hash. It's slightly larger with 160 bits and it's used in many common protocols. Collision resistance has been broken relatively recently, but still requires quite a lot of compute time. So it's somewhat secure as long as you don't require collision resistance. However, when designing anything new, it makes a lot of sense to use a more modern algorithm, because once some of the properties have been broken, we should be concerned about the others potentially as well. Now, the more modern ones are SHA-2 and SHA-3, both of which are pretty secure for years to come. They're different in the sense that they're constructed in very different ways, so breaking one of them doesn't affect the other at all. And both allow several different sizes of the hashes. And the SHA-2 is already widely used, for example in newer protocols as well as in cryptocurrencies, whereas SHA-3 is mostly a possible alternative. It's a very new construct that eliminates some of the theoretical weaknesses of earlier hashes, but people are still using a sort of wait and see approach because of the fundamentally new approach in SHA-3. So both of these are suitable. Right now, if you were to develop something, SHA-2 is typically the hash of choice. Now that we've discussed hash functions, we'll also give a very brief moment of attention to random numbers. Now, CPUs execute deterministically, in principle at least, and therefore this means they are unable to generate actual random numbers. The issue here is that we need special hardware that actually gets the source of randomness from physical processes, because any execution is going to end up with the same sequence of numbers every time. Now, lacking hardware support, a CPU cannot make truly random numbers, but we can make pseudo-random numbers. So pseudo-random numbers are computed and deterministic, but they're computed from a seed that's supposed to be sufficiently random to still make the sequence reasonably usable instead of real random numbers. Now the idea is at some point we set an initial seed, which is typically, for example, something like the date and time. And from that point onward, we compute a random number from the seed and then update the seed every time we compute a number so that the next number will be different. Now, this is a solution that generally works and is suitable for, say, games and so on, but the sequence is often predictable, and this can be an issue when we're doing cryptography. We've actually seen this issue before with the initial sequence numbers in TCP. Now the issue is the random number might leak information about the seed, which would make it possible to predict with some, at least with some certainty, what the next numbers will be. And at some point the original seed will be reached, because of course there's only a limited number of possible seed values, and then the sequence repeats. So these are issues with pseudo-random numbers. However, cryptographic algorithms often require numbers that are completely unpredictable. So a very good example would be key generation. Even if we know approximately the date and time that someone generated a key, we want to make it impossible pretty much to be able to guess. So there's a number of cryptographically secure pseudo-random number generators that should be able to prevent this issue and generate high-quality random numbers that can be used in cryptographic algorithms. The final part of the introductory lecture is on blockchain. Now, blockchain is all the hype these days, of course, so we can't really skip it, as much as perhaps we would have liked to. Now, what made blockchain so popular? Well, this is Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a decentralized digital currency. This means that people are able to transfer money directly to each other without involving banks. So the system needs some distributed way to be able to verify that these transactions are real. And this is, of course, based to some extent on cryptography. And in particular, Bitcoin is based on blockchain. The idea of blockchain is actually very simple. Each block of transactions contains the hash of a previous block. Now, if we know that a particular block is valid, it tells us that we also have previous transactions which are valid because the hash has to match them. So once we have a particular block and we know that this block is okay, then someone can present older blocks and we can tell whether they're okay or not by their hash value. As we know, a good hash should not allow one to create a new block with the same hash that is different from the original block that was hashed. Right? So we cannot change the past transactions without also changing the later ones. Now, that is the blockchain element, but Bitcoin is more than blockchain. In particular, it's very important to know what the real blockchain actually is. If there is disagreement which is the actual last block, then we're still broken, because someone could replace the last block and make a new chain before that. Now this is something we must prevent, and this is where where Bitcoin has an interesting approach. Namely, it says that the real chain is the one that at least 50% of the users agree on, where users are actually measured by compute power. Now, if someone is talking about mining Bitcoins, it's really about this. It's about showing that you have sufficient compute power to essentially authenticate the chain and say that this chain is correct. Now, this means if you want to cheat, if you want to create bitcoins for yourself that didn't exist before, or steal someone's bitcoins, then in principle, you need an obscene amount of compute power to be able to do this. Because you have to be able to match what is already out there in terms of compute power from people mining bitcoins. And of course, do keep in mind, with great power also comes a great electricity bill. So Bitcoin isn't necessarily the best for the environment. After some people made and lost a lot of money on Bitcoin, blockchain became a very popular topic. And people everywhere, often not actually computer scientists, started thinking, okay, this blockchain is interesting. What can we do with it? And blockchain has been widely proposed for many other types of uses. One of the more important ones is smart contracts, which are basically contracts that are also computer programs. So you sign the contract and then it starts actually executing the operations. So for example, it would be possible to transfer a certain amount of money using these smart contracts, say every month. Another is timestamping. So if we embed into a blockchain a hash of some document that we want to timestamp, it proves that we had the document at that point in time, which can sometimes be important in legal matters. Also, blockchain has been proposed to achieve many random other security goals. Now, it is important to note that Bitcoin seems fairly secure, so far at least, but it's not just a blockchain. Blockchain is not inherently secure because it's critical that the Bitcoin also has an approach to identify the valid last block. Without that, we don't know what the valid last block is, and we cannot be sure that the chain is actually correct. This means that blockchain is not automatically secure, as much as some people would like to make you believe this. Now, in sum, I would say you should be careful whenever blockchain is mentioned. Sometimes blockchain will not actually be necessary. So one of the core benefits of blockchain is the ability to do things in a decentralized way. This can be very useful to prevent relying on someone else's infrastructure, to prevent a single point of failure, and so on. But do keep in mind, we have public key signatures, which we will discuss later, which work perfectly well if we can assume that there's a centralized, trusted third party. And this is often the case. And if this is the case, one can wonder whether blockchain can actually be trusted more than the trusted third party. This is something, of course, that differs from case to case. Also keep in mind, blockchain is not inherently secure. As I mentioned, it's just a chain of hashes, nothing more than that. And how you use it decides how secure it actually is. Also, and this is a very important one, often people will simply use the term blockchain to refer to something that has nothing to do with blockchain. It's simply a way to give old stuff a trendy new name. Also, in many cases, blockchain isn't actually blockchain. And finally, when someone talks about a blockchain, there's a fair chance it might be simply random nonsense. So keep all of this in mind when you're thinking of blockchain. So now I gave you at least an introduction, and I hope you can apply your critical thinking. Bitcoin and blockchain are interesting and potentially valuable techniques, but do keep in mind that a lot of people are blathering about it with no idea what they're talking about, or even trying to deceive people.